and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Ruminant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Sorry if I'm a little sniffly or discombobulated this morning. It's only because I'm sniffy and discombobulated. Long story, very short. I had to get my daughter to a plane at 6:15 departure, only to find out that later it was delayed until 10. So I had to wake up at 4:45 to get her there, and then I had hoped to be able to sleep when I got back, but no luck. So here we are. Also, thank you for all the well wishes and concern and all that. I am really just a 10,000% better than I was. I've discovered that there is, an unofficial brother and sisterhood there's an unofficial tribe of victims of various forms of nasal and septum surgery out there who have many, many stories of suffering and commiseration that I've heard from. I mean, friends of mine I've known for 20 years, I had no idea that they had their schnozzles operated on in similar ways. And for those of you who have not had this kind of surgery, I have good news and bad news for you. For the most part, gleaning from lots of conversations now, if you have the operation, I'm talking about septum surgery, sinus surgery, all that kind of stuff. If you have the operation, in a planned and orderly way, not in terms of like some emergency thing where you're on a bus or something like that, it's really not that bad. The whole thing, you're knocked out. It's not super painful. You wake up, you're not in a crazy amount of pain. The downside is that the pain and the discomfort. It's amazing how I'm sure there is some line in some medical textbook or psychological textbook that talks about the point at which discomfort actually becomes pain, just because of the overwhelming nature of it. A friend of mine sent me a thing the other day about how apparently some businesses, I don't know if it's true, the thing looked true. Some businesses, in order to curtail the tendency, particularly of dudes, to just hang out on the throne in the men's bathroom during work hours, they've started developing toilets that are on a slant so that you actually have to use your leg muscles to sort of stay on target, as it were, and that this will cause leg strain after 5 minutes. And it's a way to sort of hurry people up. And maybe in one of the engineers for that, there's some point about the discomfort pain nexus, threshold. But it was, going back to my schnoz, it was just so terrible. And I will spare you all of the gory details. We talked about it a little bit on the AMA episode. I'm now feeling kind of more under the weather. I think just because the initial euphoria has worn off, and I now just have this sort of constant sinus headache, which is 10,000 times better than what it was prior to getting these splints pulled out of my nose. But it was a stressful week. DeSantis's rollout. So I missed it. I went to a friend of mine's birthday party and missed the rollout. And as my wife and I were going back in the car, we were getting the reports about what a disaster it was and all that kind of thing. And I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there for it. I didn't, it's like George Costanza talking about, it's a long 30 seconds to wait for the conditioner in your hair. When you've got a high stakes media rollout thing, every glitch seems really, really disastrous in the moment. And I'm not saying that as comms events, go, it wasn't disastrous, but I think it's more disastrous for DeSantis' comms team than for DeSantis himself as a candidate. I think it's more of a problem for Elon Musk that makes him still look not ready for prime time technologically for Twitter, which is not a great look for a guy who builds rockets and electric vehicles that can go 100 miles an hour, right? I mean, you have a really profound investment in the perception of your brand of being glitch free, and to squander some of that brand on Twitter, which itself is a squandering of Musk's time in general. I know I made this point before, but it's really kind of amazing how metaphorical Musk's takeover of Twitter was, insofar as it has been an argument among, Twitter haters and Twitter lovers and people who love to hate Twitter, which I'm sort of more in that camp, to say how it's a distraction from more productive things. It's a distraction for our culture, for our politics. It's a distraction for our children, along with other forms of social media. It's a distraction from human relationships. It's a distraction from touching grass. It's a distraction from all of the meaningful things in life. And here's Elon Musk at the forefront of the effort to make us an interplanetary species and to run the transition from fossil fuels to electric vehicles, which I'm not wholly down for. I'm just saying it's a big thing, right? And he wants to have tunnels with boring machines that move people around more quickly. And he's doing all of these like very Randian, city on the edge of tomorrow kind of, we'll all have dirigibles kind of historic stuff. And because he got addicted to Twitter, he, first of all, threw away tens of billions of dollars, but also threw away big chunks of his persona, his profile, his brand, and most importantly, his time. And so it's funny. It's like Twitter is like, both literally and figuratively like this distraction for our lives in all sorts of ways. And then the guy who supposedly symbolizes the future of like jetpacks instead of tweets gets ensorcelled by Twitter itself, right? That was the whole Peter Thiel thing about we wanted flying cars and instead we got 140 characters or whatever. Well, like Elon Musk was the flying car guy. He was the persona of that. And he got seduced by his fans and by a dumb app, and it's sort of been a vortex for the DeSantis people as well. And so that's sort of what I'd say about it. Is I think even if it went perfect, like I was saying some of this on the Dispatch podcast yesterday, but like if it had gone perfectly, I just still think it was a kind of a dumb idea to do his announcement on Twitter, particularly audio only. It just would have been so much better to have a big honking crowd, diverse Florida crowd where they're all cheering. They don't have to be paid to be there, all that kind of stuff. Where his scripted jokes would make him seem funnier than he really is, where his scripted schmaltz would make him seem more empathetic than he really is. And instead to do this very, very, literally very online thing, in the sense that like a lot of normal Americans could not figure out how to even find Twitter Spaces. I don't know how to use Twitter Spaces. And to take planted questions from, Chris Rufo and Dana Lash and all that kind of stuff. I think it does speak, the glitches speak to Musk. The desire to do it that way speaks to the coterie of people around DeSantis in a way that would make me nervous if I were a big DeSantis booster. But I think that, I don't know. There's one last thing on the announcement, which I think doesn't get as much attention for the fish don't know they're wet kind of thing. A lot of the people that we've heard from. So first of all, 2 points on this. This is what I want to say at the beginning. First of all, if you are experiencing anything in the moment, everything that goes bad is more excruciating, and the time moves a lot slower. There's actually neurological reasons for this. This is like when, that phrase where everything seemed to slow down when you're going into a car accident or something like that. That's a real neurological brain thing, because your brain has hard drives, and I am speaking entirely metaphorically and without scientific precision, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this on the science. Your brain has hard drives, and it tends not to record a lot of the stuff that you don't need to remember. I can't do the whole RAM versus ROM memory kind of thing, but like most people in this audience have gone to, let's say, the bathroom 5,000 times, 10, I don't know what the right number is, but it's thousands and thousands of times. And you can probably not remember more than a handful of them. And it's only because they were either very recent or something different and weird happened that got them filed in a different place. And similarly, but like, I guarantee you, if like the time a boa constrictor came out of your toilet, that's one of the times you would put in long-term memory in your brain. And when it's sort of like on your iPhone, when you're recording video in slow-mo, the stuff that you're recording seems to move slower on your phone. And it's because you're just recording vast amounts more data and putting it in a more secure place. And so your brain literally sort of takes in information slower when it's a new or novel experience, or it's a scary or, emotional or glandular experience or whatever, because it's taking it all in. And as part of this sort of survival, we may need this information later kind of thing. I think this is one of the reasons why, if you're driving to a new destination for the first time, the drive out seems so much longer than the drive back. And so anyway, the reason I bring this up is that I think that there's a thing that happens when you are in the moment of an event and it's delayed. It's like every time, Trump or Biden or Obama would be late for a press conference that I actually had to watch. And like being 5 more minutes late seemed like a friggin' eternity. But if you weren't paying attention to the whole thing and you just said to someone, Obama was 15 minutes late for a press conference, you say, I don't care, or that's like him or whatever, but like, it wouldn't be a dramatic thing. But when you're experiencing it in the moment, it seems much more dramatic than it is. And I think we saw a lot of that with the instant reactions on Twitter, with the instant reactions on blogs, with the, and basically from anybody who had been listening. The second thing is that I think the people who were making a big deal about it, and again, I'm not, it was a stupid screw up. It shouldn't have happened. I'm not defending it, but the people who are making a big deal about it in real time or immediately after also come really disproportionately from the world of journalists who have and politicians who have a lot of experience with live TV. And when you do live TV, every nanosecond of delay, of screw up, of confusion feels like a billion years. And I think there was some sort of, and I think there was some projection in some of the reactions, just because they could relate to that feeling of anxiety. Anyway, on the substance, I've only seen snippets about the Q&A session and all that. I read some write-ups from friends and enemies alike on it. And I don't want to repeat all the Dispatch podcast stuff, but the fact that they didn't talk, I think, at all, or at least very much, about the economy, about like bread and butter issues, but instead had a sort of, again, very online, very sort of new right adjacent conversations about, I'm not saying unimportant issues. I mean, Bitcoin really, the role of digital dollars and all that. I'm interested in both things. Well, digital dollars I'm more interested in than crypto or Bitcoin. But it just seems like it was it was narrowcasting rather than broadcasting. And the thing is, there's so much time to narrowcast in a presidential campaign to various constituencies. The time of your announcement is literally the time for the broadest casting as possible, right? There's a reason why you have more sort of generalities and, platitudes and pieties and poetry and other things that begin with P. in presidential pronouncements and in presidential announcements that get a lot of attention. It's because you are trying to entice people from broad and different coalitions to to listen to you more later. And this didn't seem like an effort like that. I just think it was ill-conceived, but also just not nearly as important as a lot of people are trying to make it out to be. So what else? I do think, I guess, we should talk about this part of it more, just as a sort of symbolic thing. It's starting to show that the populism, I mean, what are we going to call it? Let's call it populism, or the new right. Okay. I'll see if I have to, well, let's call it the new right, because I don't think all the new right people are actually populists. But I think all of the populists at this point are basically new rightish. Anyway, I'll think out loud. That's what this podcast is for. We'll just see where it goes. The people who wanted a new consensus, right? This was like this weird sort of meta thing starting in 2015 and 2016, where, broadly speaking, the people who knew better but still supported Trump anyway did so with this desire to smash the establishment. You can define the establishment in terms of like just simply partisan Republican terms, the Mitch McConnell people, the Bushes, the dynasties, all kind of stuff. Or you can define it as like the intellectual fusionist consensus, National Review commentary, AEI, heritage before the beclowning, the Claremont. Well, the Claremont Institute is different. They were not as much. They felt resentful that they were not as much as part of the consensus as they thought they should be, and so they started to lose their minds. But we'll put that aside. The zombie Reaganism, to use a pejorative term. There was this broad coalition of disparate and divergent and often disagreeable people who thought that they would benefit, or the country would benefit, if the old order, the old dead consensus, as some of them put it, was overthrown. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I get that argument. I disagree with the argument. I mean, there are lots about the old consensus that I had disagreements with, that everybody had disagreements with, because it was sort of like broad coalitions always have disagreements. And, just to restate a point here to make it very clear, I don't think libertarians ran Washington for 30 years. I don't think that everybody, was, who supported Bush was, or supported Paul Ryan, or all these things, had everything right. I don't think the conservatives had I don't think there was anything like a monolithic conservatism prior to 2015. But the people who were on the periphery, who, the further away you get from relevance, the more the people you see who are in the debate, the fewer differences you see between them. They tend to be, it's just that crowd, and they all get along, and they all know each other, and they all go to the Georgetown cocktail parties. I mean, at this point, the people who complain about Georgetown cocktail parties, I think, are losers, at least in the sense as it works on the right. Because what they're really saying is, I'm not invited to things. I feel left out. I have FOMO. I'm resentful that all you guys got to do cool stuff and I didn't. And the thing is, there wasn't all this cool stuff, right? I mean, that's the part of the problem is it's a Potemkin mirage, kind of nonsense thing that does double duty as questioning people's integrity by saying they want to be famous. It had some cachet when it was at least a barb about, conservatives who wanted credibility with mainstream media and all that kind of stuff. But it's just not really even used that way anymore. It's just basically, it's sort of like, think about it this way. The people who rant about the globalists, right, and how terrible globalism is and how horrible Davos is. I've never been to Davos. I'd like to go. I'd like to see it, mostly out of curiosity, but I have no burning desire to go. But, when you're that far locked out of something like Davos, there are a lot of people who look at it and say, oh, they must all be colluding and forming a vampire nests, because when vampires nest together, they get more vicious and they get prone to groupthink and blah, 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 blah. And you start imagining what the insiders are doing without realizing that there's a lot of diversity of opinion among the insiders. And they're not all that inside to begin with. I mean, I think the first or second big conversation on this podcast 5 years ago, whatever, was all about how nobody's actually running everything. So anyway, the reason I bring that up is that there was this critical mass of people of truly different points of view, of varying degrees of credibility or seriousness or persuasiveness, and no time to get into all the different groups, but they kind of merged into a kind of popular front and used Trump as this battering ram to attack the perceived, conservative consensus on all sorts of issues. So all these, there are all these different groups, like the different tribes in Lawrence of Arabia that had to be convinced, they sort of, I do not like comparing Donald Trump to Lawrence of Arabia, but they needed someone to rally around to put aside their differences in order to overthrow the Turks, right? And the sort of inside the Beltway, DC Republican world were the Ottoman Empire, according to these guys, and that they were the sick man of conservatism. I'm going to keep going with this stupid metaphor. Anyway, the thing that they all missed is that just because I'm not going to say they successfully overthrew the consensus or the establishment or anything like that. But let's say for the sake of argument that they can take credit for it, or that the establishment, committed suicide, which I kind of think is closer to the truth. But there is no conservative establishment anymore. No homogenous, unified. Again, I don't think there ever really was a homogenous conservative establishment, but there was more consensus, 10 years ago than there is today. The old conservative establishment is gone. CPAC is a smoldering, corrupt ruin. Heritage is full on populist now. And Fox is at war, with its own audience and in the kind of most pathetic ways. And so all of that kind of, and the Republican Party is just this enormous fecal festival, right? So it's a mess. The old regime has been in effect toppled. What a lot of these guys, and it is mostly guys, didn't seem to think through at all was that when you, and I'm speaking metaphorically here, when you topple one regime, when you topple, one ruler, you don't automatically get to, not everyone's not going to automatically agree on what the next regime should be, who the next ruler should be. This is historically always the problem with, with radicals, is they think, well, we'll think about what comes next later. First, we got to tear everything down. It's like literally what radicalism means. It means tear things down to the roots, radix. And in the early days of the new era, I'm trying to, the reason why I keep frumphering here is I'm trying to avoid coming up with phrases or terminology that are seeding things that I don't actually want to seed while and when I say seed, I mean CEDE. Yeah. I don't want to concede victories to people that I don't actually think were actually won or anything like that. But I'm just trying to think out loud here to illustrate the point, right? That just because you get rid of one regime doesn't mean everybody's going to agree on what replaces it. And so you have, at the very beginning of this, Trumpy era, you had, Sohrab Ahmari going after David French, and I thought really just profoundly flawed in silly ways. But, that's all behind us now. And Sohrab and those guys represented what have become known as the post-liberal integralists, right? And these are the people who want a integral social order where all the institutions of the society are, it's very much like sort of Woodrow Wilson's vision and a lot of the progressive era eugenicists' visions when they would talk about political life, is that, you know, it's the body politic, and that all of the organs of the body of the body politic need to work together. They shouldn't be at war with each other. Deneen has this, this whole idea about how the very notion of competitiveness, of separateness is bad. Everything has to be holistic. And I want to be really, really clear. I mean, Patrick Deneen is utterly straightforward and honest about this. Nothing new about any of those arguments. Nothing. 0.0 new. These are very old arguments, and the smart people making these, I think, incredibly wrong arguments are at least honest about that. This idea of holistic approaches and corporatism in the Catholic sense, even totalitarianism, which I'm not saying that they're totalitarians in the way we use the word today, but even when Mussolini coined the term totalitarian, he did not mean it in the Orwellian or the Soviet or the Stalinist sense. His whole thing about everything within the state, nothing outside of the state, was this very, very Catholic infused notion of society being this organic whole where everybody worked together, where the few and the many worked in tandem and had deep reservoirs of social solidarity. So anyway, I think all that stuff, I'm not saying it's all worthless, because at some scales, I think it's everything. Like, I think that's the way the family should work. And I think that's in the local communities and civic institutions should have high degrees of integralism to them. But this idea that you can expand these integral components to a continental nation of 330 something million people while maintaining economic prosperity, I just think is laughably naive and embarrassing, and really pretty juvenile. But anyway, so there were the integralists, and then there were the nationalists back in the early days of the Trumpian era. These were the Yoram Hazony guys. These are the ones who said the nation state is everything, nationalism is everything. I had all those arguments with all those people. There are overlaps between integralism and nationalism, but there are not as many as people thought there were back in the early days of this stuff. I'm not going to explain all the nationalism stuff the way I just did the integralism stuff, because I think people basically get what people are getting at about nationalism, even if I think the self-declared nationalists have all sorts of intellectual and categorical incoherence to them. But so you have the nationalists, and at first they used to do conferences together and hang out together. And during the days of the COVID stuff, you had these guys who, you had integralists and nationalists alike talking about how they were going to seize upon the populist libertarianism that had been awoken by the medico-corporate pharma state or some garbage like that. And that the Trumpian libertarian populists were going to be essentially the shock troops to, implement a new political order. And it was all nonsense, but there was all this sort of enthusiasm and Popular Front camaraderie that came with it. And it left out the fact that the Trumpian libertarian populist types didn't know who Yoram Hazony was, not in any numbers, didn't know who Sohrab Ahmadi or Patrick Deneen or Adrian Vermeule are. Well, most of them, don't know who I am. I'm not saying I'm so famous. I'm just saying that most normal Americans don't pay attention to any of these sorts of fights. These people were pissed because their kids' schools were closed or their businesses were shut down. They weren't yes, this is my moment to embrace post-liberal integralism. And likewise, large numbers of go do your own interviews of people at Trump rallies, and you'll find X number of QAnon nutters, and you'll find a much larger number of normal old Gen Xers, young baby boomers. The old baby boomers are mostly dead. And sort of salt of the earth types, and with a few other, different categories and factions of people, but none of them are profoundly into serious intellectual ideas. And to a large extent, if Trump had been essentially a Reaganite in his policies, and his most successful policies were Reaganite, but if he had acted like a sincere Reaganite with maybe a little more protectionism and a little, more, wall building and that kind of stuff, all the people who show up at those rallies would still be into Reaganism. And in fact, I think most conservatives and not most Americans, but, most normal Republicans are still into conservatism. And so anyway, I'm getting far afield, but my point is to say that there's there was never this monolithic, unified political movement that these guys, the common good conservatives, the nationalists, the integralists, none of these guys were anywhere close to ever being leaders of broad-based national movements. But they were all convinced that they could all work together. And then over time, it's been really enjoyable for me to watch as it's dawned on them that they've picked a life of being members of various obscure, political activist egghead factions now at war with each other. And what got me thinking about this is I saw this just amazing tweet. I have it open on my computer. It's a tweet thread from Sohrab Ahmari, right? And it's from yesterday. So Thursday, the day after the Dineen thing. And he says, I'm beginning to despair of the whole right, but especially the anti-woke formation, much as I loathe wokeism. There's no positive vision to it. It's unserious. It seems designed to stave off real populism at the level of political economy. Second tweet. The Biden White House has put forward a serious vision for a post-neoliberal order and an industrial policy. You may debate its parameters, but it's a vision. Meanwhile, the right is get your hands off my Bud Light. The two candidates boast about which of them is more anti-vax. The other one says, I want to burn the FDA to the ground. Yay, back to Sinclair's jungle. The fantasy of restoring a government structure fit for a pre-industrial ideal of yeoman farmers. The economic model that also assumes a pre-industrial la-la land as its backdrop. Dumb. And then he goes on and basically what some of that stuff, reading it out loud, I realize a lot of people don't understand what the hell he's talking about. But what Sohrab wants, at least so I gather, is a vigorous right of center industrial policy. I accused him and his crowd of being pro-life New Dealers, and they said, exactly, that's who we are. And he's apparently fallen in love with the writings of John Kenneth Galbraith, who was a great writer, but a crappy economist. And they're right-wing social planners, and they want to be right-wing social planners and technocrats, and they don't have anything like the bench to do that. And they're getting annoyed in the way that, there was a whole thing from Marxists back in the day about how they hated Mickey Mouse, because Mickey Mouse was this distraction from serious questions about serious, divisions of society that must be encountered with a robust revolutionary ardor. And, in the 1960s, it became the sort of Frankfurt Marxist school about, how, industrial capitalism staves off revolution by distracting people with petty, silly distractions. And the thing among the things I think is so funny about this is that Sora, made his name for himself in this crowd by being absolutely livid about Drag Queen Story Hour and attacking and really misrepresenting David French's positions on all that stuff. And now he's like saying, why are you guys getting so worked up about the transgender Bud Light ad? We need to focus on industrial policy. And I did it's amazing to me. Anyway, so back to my point about replacing consensuses or regimes or whatever. Literally the story, this is like, if you were doing a survey course on sort of the story of, I don't know, regime change, which is the title of Patrick Deneen's next book, How States Fail, which is the title of the Mansur Olson book, a very different kind of book. How the Rise and Decline of States was Mansur Olson. And How Nations Fail is the Robinson Asmogologu book. Anyway, distraction. I'm sorry. I'm rambling. You can do any sort of survey course of revolutions, regime change. I don't know what you would call it. Going back to, let's say, the Ming friggin' dynasty. This, like, one of like the major themes, if not the theme, would be how when you depose or overthrow one system of government or rule, right? And I'm not saying that they overthrow the actual regime in America, but what they did was this kind of thing is like fractals, right? It works at very small levels and very high levels. It's the same sort of thing. When you get rid of the existing authority, only very rarely do you get a consensus around a new authority almost immediately. That is like one of these things I've always been sort of fascinated by, about the whole obsession with the right of succession to the throne, right? Because through very, very, very lived experience over thousands of years in Europe, aristocrats knew that every minute there was doubt about who was next in line to the throne in princely states, in England and France, wherever. Every second of doubt created opportunities for various players to claim authority. And this is, again, like the story of politics for thousands of years. When we got rid of Saddam Hussein, we had this foolish notion that like we could just replace it with a new government. No, different factions and factors that had been buried rose up, try to claim their own, all that kind of stuff. We had two popes more than a few times in European history because of these kinds of dynamics. If you go back and you look at the number of Christian denominations that explode after the Protestant Reformation, the Zwinglians, the Calvinists, the Lutherans, the Anabaptists, the this, the that, the whatever. You can go down this. It's hundreds and hundreds of them. Some are nation-based, some are doctrine-based. It's just wild. But in fact, if you actually look at, there is this sort of Romantic Catholic notion that prior to the Reformation, there was this homogeneous consensus about a one universal church. In fact, that wasn't true either. Go look at the number, look at Wikipedia. I'll do it right now. Here's the Wikipedia page on proto-Protestantism, which I gather is Protestantism before Luther kind of broke the dam. Here are movements that have been argued as having similar ideas as Protestantism before the Reformation. Montanism and Tertullian. Montanists were a sect of ascetics that were against many developments in the early church and to which Tertullian converted. Let's see. The anti-Decomarians, Eris of Sebast, Helvidius, Jovinian, and Jovinianism, with subcategories of Samartio, Barbentius. There was Vigilantus, one of the only ones I know anything about. Augustine of Hippo, the Paulicians, the Byzantine iconoclasm, Claudius of Turin, Gottschalk of Orbay, Ratromanus, Tondarchians, Aelfric of Eidesham, the Berengar of Tours, the Albigeneses. I mean, I know you guys who know this stuff are going to be laughing at my pronunciation of all of this. The Bosnian Church, Padoraria. Okay, I'm going to stop here because there are literally dozens and dozens of more. Gregory of Rimini, Friends of God. And of course there was Jan Hus, who I knew a little bit about because Mussolini, when I was reading all about Mussolini for liberal fascism, he was obsessed with Jan Hus and his uprising. And the point is that the old consensus prior to the Reformation was pretty difficult to hold on to. And the Catholic Church was constantly looking out for heresy, and there were all sorts of schisms, the Byzantine Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, there are it's a great bar trivia question. It was like, how many different Christian denominations recognize the Catholic, the Pope of the Catholic Church as the head of their church? And it's like a dozen of them. Which is just, and none of this is criticism of any kind. I'm just pointing out that rumors of Christian hegemony and homogeneousness prior to the Reformation are greatly exaggerated. But it was even crazier after the Reformation, because after the Reformation, you had all of these different sects, denominations, churches, whatever. Again, I'm not trying to denigrate anything or anybody, that for a while thought that they can compete to be the leaders of the new one true faith for everybody. And then you just had sort of balkanization and conflict. And so now we're in this moment where you've got the sort of so again, this is all very long, extended, I guess, simile, right? I berated Guy on the last podcast for getting metaphor and simile wrong, and someone sent me an email pointing out that I might have gotten analogy wrong, which I think he's probably right. I'd have to go back and hear what I actually said. But anyway, this is one long comparison to this present moment where you have DeSantis, who is very much on the same page with Trump on a lot of policy stuff, but actually has his own sort of distinct sect of the branch, division, following of the Republican Party and of the sort of egghead right. I don't think I literally, truly don't think there are a lot of legitimate intellectuals who still support Donald Trump. I think it's disqualifying. There's some very smart people. I just think they've lost their minds. Which is not to say, look, if they're making sincere, I think really dumb, but sincere arguments about how he's, the best option to beat Joe Biden or some cost benefit garbage like that, that's fine. But anybody who purports to be an intellectual who makes arguments about how Trump is a serious person with serious ideas, I just can't take seriously. And I will strain to take any other position anyway. But so you have, in a way, DeSantis comes across, in at least that Twitter thing, is kind of like a right-wing Gramscian. Gramsci was one of the great Italian intellectuals, who's a guy who talks about the long march through the institutions. And actually, he didn't coin the phrase that came from some, I think, 1970s German radical. But that radical was like a Gramsci guy. And the basic idea is that if you really want to have influence over the culture, you have to take over the institutions of power. You have to seize the commanding heights of the culture, and you have to use the state to bend the culture in your direction. And that increasingly seems to be where DeSantis comes down on that. And that is not really Trumpism. Trump is much more of your classic sort of corrupt Caudillo kind of guy who likes making, likes making deals with his cronies and, rewarding his cronies and that kind of stuff. He definitely believes in economic growth. I'm not saying DeSantis doesn't believe in economic growth. But Trump's relationship to almost all of the stuff that DeSantis takes seriously was always just purely instrumental, nearest weapon to hand bunk. And so it's interesting in the same way that you see like the integralists turning out to be a fairly fringe segment of the, I don't think you can call the right a coalition anymore. Right. It's a stripe it's a shaded area on the right side of the political spectrum, and how big that shaded area is, I don't know. And the nationalists, that depends what you mean by nationalists these days, because, lots of people use these words. One of the things I do appreciate about the post-liberal integralists is they are so bad at politics that they've picked a name that nobody's going to confuse for some other faction. It's not like they called themselves the religion is good conservatives, right? Because then who are you talking about? Because all the conservatives talk about religion is good one extent or the other. You call yourself the post liberal integralists. You've nailed down, you own that brand, right? No one's going to try and steal your brand. The nationalists, there are lots of different groups and people who call themselves nationalists and natcons. And it gets a lot of the more decent sort of, nationalist, conservative types causes them all sorts of headaches because they're stuck with an enormous number of jackasses who use the same label as them. And but anyway, what we're seeing now is just, it's just a bunch of different factions contending for power and influence, and, and some really care about public policy, and, some care about public policy to the extent it wins over votes for them. And I would not have thought that DeSantis when he ran for governor in what was it, 2018, I would not have expected that DeSantis would have been as much of a policy wonk as he turned out to be. He cares about, public policy. I think that's actually the real Ron DeSantis. The fake Ron DeSantis was the guy who beclowned and humiliated himself reading, The Art of the Deal to his kid in a TV commercial, and, talking about build the wall and you're fired to his kids, using his kids as props, which I despised. And people say I should get over it. Look, I've gotten over it. I would vote for, if I had to vote in the primary, I would certainly vote for DeSantis over Trump. I'm not entirely critical of DeSantis, but I've been critical of people who use children as props in politics my entire adult life. Why would I not be critical of DeSantis for it, particularly when he was doing it to suck up to Donald Trump, and claim that he would be a loyal Donald Trump, follower of the president when he was when he was running for governor of a state. Governors of states do not answer to the president of the United States. But anyway, I think I would have thought that DeSantis's approach to public policy was the same as his approach to MAGAism, which was it's a position you take because you think it's going to win you votes. And I'm not sure that they think that at this point, because I think the way they're getting granular and the kinds of public policy stuff that they're choosing to do, I don't know that it's a big vote getter for DeSantis. I think it's the stuff that he actually legitimately cares about. It's not as insincere and cynical as his embrace of Trump was. I think that's interesting. And so it's interesting how what looked like what was the MAGA faction is actually a bunch of smaller denominations that are increasingly at war with each other. again, the nationalists and the integralists were all kumbaya in the early days of the Trump presidency. They now hate each other. You have the guys who want, actual public policy wins and results, largely rallying to people like DeSantis, and the people who just like performative, I am your retribution nonsense are rallying more to Trump. The problem for DeSantis is that, and for the other Republicans in the field, is that there are just a lot of lazy Republican voters now who are just saying they're for Trump. I don't think their support is that deep, but they do have a bond with Trump, and they do have this preposterous position that Trump is worth supporting the more the mainstream media hates him and picks on him. And I ranted about that on the Dispatch podcast yesterday, so I won't get into it again, but it's, I think it's a preposterous position. Enough about factionalism and all that stuff. I find it, well, maybe not enough, but I find it very heartening, in part because there's a certain, I told you so complex, aspect to it for me. As listeners of this podcast know, I was always profoundly skeptical that any of this stuff was going to translate into a sweeping, large political movement that was actually going to attract more voters than it repulsed. And I think that also is true at scale. Trumpism attracted new voters to the GOP, but it cost the GOP more voters than it attracted. And that was true in 2018. It was true in 2020. It's true in 2022. And if things keep going in this way, it'll be true in 2024. But when I was skeptical about this stuff back in those days, the scorn that these guys would heap on me, these guys who were all high on their own farts because they had put together a conference that got 200 people, and they think, this is proof. There are millions who support us. These are just the ones who could make it here. I mean, they sort of reminded me of the French guy from Close Encounters who's talking about how the people who actually made it to Devil's Tower to see the aliens, these were just the handful of people who could make it through all of the filters and obstacles to like return to go to Devil's Tower like salmon, returning to their spawning grounds. These guys, they had this tendency of looking at, my tweet got 5,000 tweets, retweets, my tweet got 100,000 likes. And they think that, okay, that means this is a political movement, and it's not, this is one of the great lessons you get from working at National Review, which, it was in the water there that you understood that politics is always going to be a long fight. There are no total victories. There are no total defeats. Things come and go your way. You take your wins where you can. You take your losses where you can. But politicians will always disappoint you. And the people who get worked up with their enthusiasm, no, this time is different. You don't understand. It's a new politics. It's a new right. It's a new this. It's a new that. We have the wind at our backs. And, I've been writing about there's no such thing as new politics for as long as I've been writing about politics. It's just it's just politics. It's what, in Omen 3, when they're talking about the signs of the Antichrist returning, they say, that the formation of the EU or the precursor to the EU was one of the signs because there's some line in the Bible about how the eternal sea and the eternal sea is supposed to be politics. And that always stuck in my head because politics is the expression of human nature at scale. And, which is why war is politics by other means, right? I mean, it's human beings interacting as human beings. And the idea that you're going to create new politics, I'm not saying it can never happen. I actually happen to think that, 1776 or 1789 was one of those new moments. That's why I wrote a book talking about the miracle, because all of the time prior to, say, 1700, things looked more similar than different going back 2,000, 5,000 years. And, but now, the dust is settling and it's dawning on a lot of people that like, no, it's like people, like there are factions and we're all basically high level, very fortunate hobbyists and that we get to make a living out of this. But, if that Vanity Fair piece is true, the American conservative, which I tend to like, I'm not trying to dunk on them, but, they hailed themselves as, the precursors of of this new right before we called this new right the new right, right? They sort of were Buchanan aligned. If Vanity Fair is right, it has 3,000 subscribers. I'm told that Compact, Sorab's joint, has about that many subscribers. Now, we at the Dispatch, we still think of ourselves as like a pirate skiff, right? We still think of ourselves as like our best days are ahead of us. There's still a lot of work to do. We're very happy with how we've done. But we haven't hit our goals on our own terms yet. And everyone's saying, oh, there's no market for what you're doing. And we hear this all the time. And that's what people told us from the beginning. Mark Hemingway had this, really snarky line in the Atlantic when we launched, talking about how there was just zero market for the kind of thing that we were doing. And, he said it with great authority. Well, we are doing orders of magnitude better than the American conservative and Compact. I mean, orders of magnitude. And I'm not saying that to boast. I'm just saying that like, we're still a fairly small operation. And by no means do we think we're conquering the world and that we are representing the true views of conservatism as people understand it today, or of the Republican Party, or any of that kind of stuff. But National Review, I don't know what its current subscriber numbers are, but I'm assuming between NR Plus and the actual magazine, it's probably like 80,000 or something like that. That's great. That's better. It's better than us, and it's better than Compact and American Affairs and American Conservative, all those guys combined and then multiplied by itself. And yet, when you hear all these people talk about all these very online activist people talking about how places like NR and certainly the Dispatch don't matter anymore, and all this kind of stuff, or in our case, never mattered. We got much bigger audiences than they do. I have much bigger Twitter following than all of these people who tell me I'm irrelevant all the time. And again, I don't say it to say that we're so much, more successful or greater or any of that kind of stuff. I say it to say that it's a big friggin' country where most of the people don't give a rat's ass about politics. And most people and a lot of the people who do give a rat's ass about politics, including very passionate people, don't think seriously about politics. And if we could go back to one thing, which I've been arguing for since I first started writing, is that the great thing about the conservative movement, the thing I loved about it, I can't tell you how many columns I've written about this, was that conservatives argued amongst themselves. They had serious disagreements about philosophy, about dogma, and all these kinds of things. They admitted their priors and all of that. And the nice thing about this moment is that maybe we're returning to some of that, as a lot of these guys realize that their tribe isn't actually going to get to control Mecca and Medina and rule arbitrarily according to their whims, that they're going to have to persuade other people to draw people to their tribe. And that's the thing I've been arguing for all this time. And I'm a little hopeful, by the shattering of the forces of the new consensus before they ever achieved any actual success in creating a new consensus. I think that's a sign of progress. How long have I gone here? My God, I apologize to those. But I'll tell you, the people who I never hear from anybody saying you went too long. I shouldn't say anybody. I rarely hear from anybody saying I went too long. I hear from a lot of people who say, oh, the 90-minute solo was a real treat. Thank you. That kind of thing, which I'm very flattered by. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who think I go too long, but they stop listening long before I've gone too long. So I don't want to go upstairs yet. My dogs are going to yell at me. I talked about a lot of stuff on the Dispatch podcast. Now let me briefly at least defend part of the Wednesday G file, which if you were a subscriber, you would have read. I agree. It had quite a gear change where I started with this sort of mocking thing about this Pete Buttigieg interview in Wired, which I do think was embarrassing and silly, and utterly mockable. I hadn't realized that the guys at the Editors Podcast had already done a whole segment on it, but it was nice to hear that, because whenever, like I was saying to Guy the other day, sometimes when you feel like maybe you've gone far afield, it's nice to have other people that you respect sort of have the same reactions. Anyway, this is just so people who didn't read the Wired thing or the G file know what I'm talking about. This is how this woman, Virginia Heffernan, begins her profile and interview with the Secretary of Labor. I'm sorry, the Secretary of Transportation. The curious mind of Pete Buttigieg holds much of its functionality in reserve, even as he discusses railroads and airlines down to the pointillist data that is his current stock in trade. The U.S. Secretary of Transportation comes off like a Mensa black card holder who might have a secret go habit or a 3-second Rubik's Cube solution or a knack for supplying off the top of his head the day of the week for a random date in 1404, along with a non-condescending history of the Julian and Gregorian calendars. Yeah, that's the total vibe I get from Pete Buttigieg too. But anyway, I did not plan on segueing into this whole thing about the history of Western civilization, but I kind of used him as a springboard to make this broader point, and I think it's an interesting point. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, at one point I say, let me back up. Prior to the Enlightenment, the lines between secular and sacred authority were blurry. Yes, after the Reformation, we were talking about the Reformation just earlier. Yes, after the Reformation, state authority and church authority were separated somewhat. But the Protestant kings were also the heads of their churches, and the Catholic kings still derived their legitimacy from the church and deferred to its authority on many things. Moreover, the church was often the seat of learning and science. The Enlightenment wanted to clean all this stuff up. Those on the right wing of liberalism wanted to have clear lanes for different institutions and power centers. This stuff is in the throne's portfolio, but this other stuff belongs to political authorities, or the family, or to the private sector, or to the people generally. This view explains the emphasis on divided powers, checks and balances, religious liberty, family values, and traditionalism generally. The state is there to do the things the state is justly and lawfully prepared to do, and nothing else. So the reason I bring this up is, I read and reviewed this Patrick Deneen book, and he calls me and people like me, right liberals, and I think it's a pretty crappy, bad faith argument. But I get it. And there's a level at which it is not crappy or bad faith, which is to say that conservatives in the Anglo-American political tradition are, what are they trying to conserve? They're trying to conserve the ideals and aspirations of the founding that are expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And that's a liberal project, right? I wrote about this in Liberal Fascism. I've written about this a zillion times. American conservatism is about more than simply classical liberalism, but as I wrote in Liberal Fascism, an American conservatism that doesn't conserve classical liberalism isn't worth conserving. And there's a lot of room for social conservatism in classical liberalism. And if you don't believe that, just look at the way people lived and the way governments worked for the first 100 years of the American founding, or the American experiment. There was not an inherent contradiction there. Now, people like Deneen and these guys say there is, and they say that the second you get Locke, like Locke's second treatise, and The Wealth of Nations, and later Hume, it's inevitable that you get drag queen story hour or whatever. I just think that's nonsense. But in this sense, people, the traditional American conservatives, who like the founding, who like celebrate the 4th of July, think that we should adhere to the Constitution as originally understood and as amended. In the grand scheme of the post-Enlightenment, last 300, 400 years, whatever, we're on the right side. I mean, we're right liberals, right? The reason why I think it's a crappy term is because when it's used by the people who use right liberal, want to make it sound like, everyone from Tom Sowell and Rush Limbaugh and Russell Kirk and William F. Buckley and James Burnham and Irving Kristol we're all just basically libertarians utterly at peace with social and cultural disintegration and dissolution. And it's bad faith in that sense. But in the broad wolf of things, yeah, sure, okay, we're right liberals. What did the left liberals believe in? Now, a lot of people, including Fukuyama and to a certain extent Deneen, they totally defensively say it comes from sort of Rawlsian notions, sometimes Rousseauian, which I would agree with, notions of authenticity, self-expression, personal autonomy, that kind of thing. And I think they're right. But I think you can go back. I mean, Rousseau is totally fair, and everyone's heard me rant about Rousseau a million times. But anyway, the way I've been thinking about it lately is and this is what I got into with the G file, is that the left liberals, right? They wanted to get rid of monarchy and the rule of the Catholic Church. The really radical ones at the beginning were people like, was it Diderot says, the last king should be strangled with the entrails of the last priest. But those guys, particularly people like Robespierre, they were not in any way against absolutism and absolute authority of the state. They just wanted it to be ruled on rational grounds, right? And so you have the whole year zero thing. Notre Dame is turned into a temple of reason. Things go off the rails when the human beings turn out to actually have interests and desires that don't fit a plan. So you get the terror. Lots of people are killed. Go listen to the Revolutions podcast on the French Revolution, or at least, the last 30 episodes. And there's great context for all this. But, and so like the way to think about it is that it's not that they wanted the right liberals said, oh, look, it turns out that, religion is good, but religion needs to stay in its lane. Right? Religion needs to be in charge of the things that religion is in charge of. And hey, look, it turns out that this new bourgeois class, this new mercantile class, it's making a lot of people richer and happier and more successful. It's paying for the ability to get more people to learn how to read and to clean up our cities. And it's improving it's providing what Francis Bacon would call the relief of man's estate with new inventions. And it shouldn't run everything, but it should be given space to do what it wants. And hey, look, it turns out that the individual is a pretty good judge of his own desires and hopes. Maybe the individual should be sovereign and be able to make a lot more decisions for him or herself. And really at that time it was mostly himself, but you get my point. And so the right liberals believed in zones of autonomy, zones of competing authority. And what they recognized, and I know everyone from Burke to Montesquieu, right? Obviously Locke and Smith, what these guys recognized was that when power is combined in one place, it is going to be abused because there is no check. There's no balance on the arbitrary whims of the authority or collective or entity that is in charge of things. When there's nobody who has the power to do anything about it, you're going to have very few people say, hey, that's not a good idea. Don't do that. And so the way to create these zones of freedom, these zones of liberty, these zones for competing forms of authority was to actually divide the government itself into different branches, different sources of authority for different functions. And that's why you get, Montesquieu and then the founding fathers about divided government, checks and balances, separation of powers, and all of that. The left liberals of the Enlightenment, they never were at peace with any of that. They, yes, they thought that the rule of custom and tradition, never mind of the Catholic Church or of the throne, was corrupt and corrupting and illegitimate. But the reason why it was all those things was because it wasn't rational. And reason should rule all. And therefore, the smartest people with the greatest power of intellect should be the rulers. And that's what you can sort of get out of the French Revolution. For a while, it's what brings you Napoleon to restore order and whatnot. And so I think that this spirit has been very much central to, we can call it progressivism, leftism, left liberalism, left liberals, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of diversity here. I can't paint with a sweeping brush, but I think that this general orientation manifests itself in many parts of the left over the last 300 years. And so one of the ones I talked about, was Auguste Comte, who came up with the religion of humanity, where he basically wanted to make scientists like Newton into secular saints. And, you even had Robespierre talking about how you needed to cultivate the religious instinct in support of the state in its project of hyper rationalism. Marxism, which you can debate how much it's in the Enlightenment tradition. Some could argue it's extremely in the Enlightenment tradition, and some could argue that it is like trying to be, there's a reason why all these post-liberal right-wingers like a lot of Marxist arguments, because Marxist arguments are also post-liberal. But what it shares with this stuff is this idea that there's one right answer, that history, the study of history is a science, that history unfolds scientifically, that material circumstances generate politics and political realities to such a degree that you can talk about it as a scientific process, in the same way that you could talk about adding, peroxide and, something else to make it go fizz, right? That's a scientific process. Once you understand the chemicals, you can repeat it time and time again. The Marxist approach is very similar. It says that there is this objective scientific understanding of the correct understanding of politics. And therefore, the people with the deepest and the most sincere understanding of these scientific forces, they should be in charge of hastening this process. And that's actually that's Lenin's addition or modification of Marxism, is the idea of the avant-garde, right? That the party needs to be full of people who so understand Marxism that they can trigger the right reactions in society to bring the rest of society along. And it's run throughout progressivism. And I got to thinking about it, as I say in the G file. I'm sorry, I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that Marxism is throughout progressivism, although you can make that case. I'm one of these guys who thinks Marx's influence is less than people think it is, because what Marx's ideas were versions of mental tropes, ideological instincts that are common to people who have never read a word of Marx. And so, like, a lot of people say, hey, look at the family resemblance between these things. This thing must have been influenced by Marx. And it's like, no, both of these things are downstream of this other impulse. And the other impulse is essentially, as I put it a bunch of times, a lot of progressives think that the state should do the things God would do if God existed. And I've always thought that there was a certain amount of hubris to this. So this, I'm not going to get into my critique of Rawls's veil of ignorance thing again, but there's this tendency to, among social planner types, to say, if I were God, how would I set this thing up? And I think that one of the things that Orthodox Christians and Jews are better at understanding is that you can't actually know what God would do, except insofar in the places where it's written down. Or at the very least, it's really hard to figure out what God would do in a hypothetical situation, because God's wisdom is infinite, and he just has access to more data than you do. And he has a lot more data, access to data than, even in, artificial intelligent computers. And so, that creates a certain humility in the Orthodox or the doctrinaire Christian or Jew or religious person, that it's sort of like Chesterton's thing is about once you convince people God doesn't exist, it's not that they won't believe in anything, it's that they'll believe in everything, or something like that. The quote. Please don't send me emails about what the exact quote is. I'm talking now for over an hour with basically no notes. And sometimes I'll have malapropisms. I know they're malapropisms. I mean, when I get substantial stuff wrong, I got no problem, being corrected and all that kind of stuff. But like, I get a lot of email from people who, like, because I got some words wrong in a movie quote. He's like, the real quote from The Godfather is blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Okay, fine. That's great. But I know that I don't really need to be hectored about it. But anyway, there is this sort of theotropic, desire that I think is part of human nature for a lot of people, and not just left-wing people, to think about, designing how to design society perfectly, from a drawing board, from God's point of view. And I think that what is dangerous about that point of view is that it leads people to think that all systemic procedural obstacles towards the destination that they want to get to are somehow trivial or illegitimate, and that they can just be ignored so long as you're going in the right direction. The system is really, the rules and the procedure, they're there to keep the other guys in check, not us. We know what to do. We have access to the data. We believe in science. And that's, I think that is one of the defining features of technocracy. And it's been one of the defining attributes of, I would argue, left, left liberals of the Enlightenment, right? Is this idea of the problem wasn't getting rid of the problem wasn't authority and absolutism, and the problem was the institutions that had authority and that were absolute were the wrong institutions. We can design the right institutions to use that power for good. That's what Woodrow Wilson believed. Believe me, I can quote you chapter and verse on that. That's what most of the progressive intellectuals believe to one extent or another. It's obviously what most of the Jacobins believed. And I'd say that one of the epiphanies I've had, and probably this is why I've talked about all this stuff for so long on this podcast today, is that my entire career, I thought that for the most part, the fatal conceit is what Hayek calls it. Of, thinking that you can plan everything, thinking that you can have mastery, right? Walter Lippmann used to talk about drift and mastery, and that we needed, experts who were masters who could control our fate, right? This whole idea of designing society from above, of moving everybody in the same direction. My entire adult career, 3 books in, I've thought that this was, at least in the American political tradition, pretty much a wholly left-wing, left enlightenment, or Marxist or progressive, right? Different flavors, whatever, point of view. And, my whole thing about how conservatism is about comfort with contradiction, this idea that you can have competing truths, competing dogmas, competing centers of power, competing institutions, competing identities in your own life, competing priorities, that conservatism was understanding life as a balancing test, and that you couldn't make the world perfect. You could only make it good. And even then that's really hard, but you could at least you can endeavor to make the slice of it that's around your own life good. And the interesting thing to me is how, and I just finished a draft script for Adam for this intellectual history series we're thinking about doing, that gets into some of this. But what's interesting to me is how the right is now what is called the right in American politics today. The DeSantis right, the Trump right, the post-liberal integralists, the nationalists, they are all turning their back on that basic idea about conservatism. They think that they have special access to God's will, or they have special access to some capital T truth about how the whole of society should be designed. And they think they have the expertise to implement it. And they share this attitude of the left that I have such abiding contempt for, that the institutions that check power, the procedures, the processes, the rules, those are only worth caring about when they restrict the other people. And man, do people care about it when, when the other side breaks the rules, everybody, becomes a crazy ass constitutionalist. But when your own side breaks the rules, you're like, oh, these are outmoded means, they're illegitimate, they're undemocratic, right? And to me, this is like the most remnant insight is this horseshoe theory about how big chunks of the right are joining the left. Big chunks of a big chunk of right liberals are becoming left liberals. Some of them, are actually becoming monarchists and ultramontane Catholics and all that kind of stuff. But what basically they're doing is they are going back to an earlier form of Enlightenment thinking, that has lots of flavors and deep cuts and call outs to pre-Enlightenment thinking. But as it manifests itself in real world political arguments, they're gung-ho on industrial policy and economic planning. And moreover, what makes them, particularly interesting or scary right now, depending on your point of view, is as much as they're into social planning as a cultural thing, right? They think that they know how to expertly move dials and doodads and levers and all that kind of stuff to design the culture from above as well. And I think it's all folly. And Anyway, what got me thinking about all this was like Charlie Cook had just a fantastic post about this Ezra Klein op-ed in the New York Times where Klein came out against the debt ceiling scheme of declaring that the 14th Amendment gives the president essentially the power of the purse and it would allow him to just simply pay debts without approval from Congress. You can listen on the legal side to Sarah and David talk about it. It's lawless. It's unconstitutional. It's folly. It's a power grab. It's gross. But none of those are Ezra Klein's objections to the idea. His objection is that if Biden did it, it would get litigated. Right? Biden said this too. Like the problem with that idea is like, I think I have that power, but it would get litigated and then it would go to the courts and then the court would say it's not constitutional because it's not. And then we'd have like, as Janet Yellen has said, we'd have a constitutional crisis. But for Klein and Biden, the thing is that it would take too long and it would, in Klein's argument, it would politically backfire because the Supreme Court would say it's unconstitutional. Now, Charlie's point is that why can't Klein just admit that it's unconstitutional? It's just flatly unconstitutional. It's just a ludicrous argument that it's constitutional. But, Klein comes from this very progressive tradition of we have all the answers. We know exactly what we're doing and anything that gets in our way is illegitimate or suboptimal or ideology driven and not, good politics, not good public policy. Right. It's why Tom Friedman wanted to be China for a day, just so he could implement good policy, optimal policies without any of that checks and balances and rule of law or democracy stuff getting in the way. And that's Ezra's argument here is like he says, it'll go to Supreme Court and 3 conservative justices are going to say it's unconstitutional. And then that'll create problems for Biden. And Charlie's point was like, yeah, politically, you're right. It would create problems for Biden, but who gives a rat's ass about that? It's also just against the law. It is just lawless. And for a fact that if Trump were in office and tried this scheme, and he would try it if he thought it would help him, right? I mean, imagine what Trump could do dropping $1 trillion coins into the treasury so he could pay off his friends in various, demographics in perpetuity. Ezra would immediately run to the correct constitutional argument. That is unconstitutional. But there's no concern about the moral hazard about like empowering future presidents, including Donald Trump, who has a non-trivial chance of being the next president of the United States from having this power. And that's the thing is like the rules have to count for your own side or they're not rules. The Constitution has to be for everybody or it's for nobody. And that's the real, getting back to the beginning, I guess, that's the real dethroning I worry about. If you actually convince people, which like everyone from John Fetterman and Bernie Sanders on down are trying to do, that the Supreme Court is illegitimate for all these stupid reasons, do you think the country's going to be in better shape where politicians don't think that they have to abide by Supreme Court rulings? Do you think that's going to be better for our national health, our social peace? Or do you think it's going to create more chaos, more warring tribes? The lefties who want to like get rid of the Electoral College and get rid of, and pack the Supreme Court and do all these kinds of things. They have the same problem a lot of these guys on the right do, which is they think if they can just defeat the reigning consensus right now, air quotes around consensus, right? That if they could just have one complete real victory, they would never have any more political problems and they could solve all of their problems in America. And that's the point. There are no permanent victories. Politics will always be there. And the conservative small c and big C correct position, as far as I can tell, is that you want to create structures and systems and expectations of our politics that put us on a steady, peaceful, safe path towards a more prosperous and more happy, good society. And the pursuit of one-time victories where you're going to settle all debts and fix all problems is inherently destabilizing. And the pursuit of it from various factions on the left and the right now is why I call this podcast The Remnant. All right, I'm done. I apologize. I just wanted to spite some people who said I should never do this again by going long. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for all the well wishes, and I will see you next time. No, I'll talk to you next time. That's what I say on Fridays or Saturdays or whatever. Coffee.